Hey y'all, and welcome back to another episode of Flick Connection, where in less time than you spend scrolling for something to watch every night, I'm going to tell you about a bunch of really graphic and intense, but excellent movies you can catch on Netflix this weekend. That's right, I'm not a big fan of what you would call Hallmark Channel movies, and this list is going to be full of a lot of movies that are on the opposite end of the spectrum, but they're not all hyper-violent movies either. I've got a horror movie, a raunchy comedy, and one of the most intense survival stories I've ever seen put to film. Thanks to Factor for sponsoring another video. We'll talk about them later in this episode, but I do want to start with that horror movie, which is also a somewhat recent release titled X. Now, this was a breakout movie for Mia Goth. There's actually a sequel to this titled Pearl that's pretty good. I'm partial to this porno-themed horror movie, though. This takes place in the 70s. You got a group of young film enthusiasts, we're going to call them for the sake of this review. They go out to a house in the country to shoot a dirty movie. Now, Mia Goth is really the lead. She's excellent, but you've also got Jenna Ortega, who really almost seems out of place in this movie, but she's fantastic in it as well. All in all, this ends up being kind of a classic slasher movie. It's got some interesting touches that make it new and fresh and kind of relevant for today, even though it takes place in the 70s. And it feels so authentic, mainly because it's directed by Ty West, who has a real eye for like vintage horror. He also did The Sacrament and The House of the Devil. X, not being quite as refined as some of his other work. Like I said, this is ultimately a raunchy movie, but it's still a good time if you're into slasher flicks. If that's not your bag though, don't worry, I've got plenty more on this list for you. My next pick, American Assassin, being a real crowd pleaser actually, on top of it being way more graphic than I think most people would expect. In fact, movies in this genre are often given a PG-13 rating and are fairly neutered in terms of the action and the violence, meaning even though there's high body counts in movies like this, they're rarely hyper-violent. I mean, it seems kind of like your typical crowd pleaser PG-13 spy movie that's easily forgettable, and American Assassin is not. It's got a lot more meat on the bone than you typically get with this genre. Some real visceral violence, and also a plot that goes over the top, but only just so. It gets just over the top enough to make a really entertaining movie without going to fairy tale land that just makes you completely lose it. It's actually a really well-balanced movie considering how wild it ultimately gets. All right, I said I had a raunchy comedy on the list. It's coming up next, and then after that, I've got an even raunchier drama. But No Hard Feelings is next up on the list.
This isn't the way to my house.
It's a shortcut. You're my hostage. What you got down there? Something for me? Why?
This stars Jennifer Lawrence and is almost kind of a reverse version of The Graduate. In this movie, she plays a young woman who's down on her luck, and not just any young woman. She is a absolute wild woman in this movie. A real beast of a woman, if you catch my drift. She's hired by a wealthy couple to have sex with their 19-year-old son. He's yet to come out of his shell, they're worried about him, and they hire this total babe of a woman to date him and sort of get him to open up, not just sexually, but emotionally, and just really start to pursue things with his life. That's their goal. They kind of pick the wrong woman to do that. Anyway, the simple setup there actually creates a lot of really funny scenes in this movie. She is hilarious. I've always loved her as a comedy actor. This one also goes into some over-the-top directions, but it's a raunchy comedy. Like, it's a teen sex comedy. I'm not sure what else you would expect. In terms of teen sex comedies, though, this one lands somewhere between really silly ones like Sex Drive and really serious ones like The Graduate. It leans more towards the silly, though. Now, a raunchy movie that does not have a single stitch of silliness in it is my next pick, Blonde. Now, this is a biopic on Marilyn Monroe, and I can understand why people were disappointed with this movie. If they wanted to see kind of this lofty romantic thing about Marilyn Monroe, this is not the movie to do that. This was actually written and directed by Andrew Dominik, who's most famous for the assassination of Jesse James and Killing Them Softly, both starring Brad Pitt. But in this movie, you follow Marilyn Monroe, played by Ana de Armas, who does an amazing job. The cinematography in the movie is absolutely insane. It's almost unhinged. It changes from scene to scene and is just breathtaking from moment to moment, but also the story is incredibly heartbreaking. I mean, we know she met a tragic end, but The filmmaking style is so strong in Blonde that it really puts you in some intense moments of her life. Whether they're accurate or not, Blonde ultimately depicts kind of what happened, I think, to a lot of women in Hollywood, whether they became as famous as Marilyn Monroe or not. And the movie has a lot to say about the cost of fame, how women were treated during that time period. I mean, it's a long list of themes it plays with, and it plays with all of those, I think, a lot more than it does with the actual true life of Marilyn Monroe. It actually takes her true life and turns it into this almost more of an experience than an actual completed film. In fact, I would say Blonde has some of Andrew Dominik's best filmmaking within it, without actually being his best film overall. Before we get to the rest of the movies on this list, I do want to tell you about one of the best things I've introduced into my life recently. It happens to be today's sponsor, Factor. Factor lets you skip meal planning, grocery shopping, chopping, prepping, cleaning with their fresh, never frozen meals delivered directly to your door. You can choose from up to 30 different chef-crafted meals every single week, and they're meals that support a healthy lifestyle but also help support your dietary needs, whether it's keto-friendly, low-calorie, vegan and veggie, or more wholesome options. I love the Protein Plus meals. It is just great for me having a stack of ready-to-go meals in the fridge that I know are nutritious and packed with protein. I don't have to go drive to a fast food place, wait in line, pay the same amount or more for a meal that is not giving me nutrition and that is honestly bad for my body. I've had the jalapeno lime cheddar chicken several times. It's absolutely delicious. I mean, this stuff tastes like restaurant food. In this creamy Parmesan chicken, it's hard to tell in this video, but it is a huge piece of chicken and it was seasoned really well. Again, just tastes like something I ordered in a restaurant and it was ready in 2 minutes. Both of those meals have over 40 grams of protein. They've also got fresh smoothies and shakes. The smoothies are delicious, but the cold brew latte protein shake is insane. It is one of the best protein shakes I've ever had. They even have wellness shots that are packed with vitamins, adaptogens, and all sorts of great stuff. And right now, my viewers can get 50% off their first order when they visit Factor75.com and use my code FlickConnection50. But on top of that discount, Factor is going to let you choose from 2 different wellness shots with every order while you're an active member if you sign up now. Again, to get 50% off and free wellness shots for life, go to Factor75.com and use my code FlickConnection50. It's an amazing deal, but speaking of amazing stuff, let's talk about the rest of the movies on this list. Next up, we've got a banger of a crime movie from South Korea. If you don't do subtitles, don't worry though. This one has an excellent dubbed version included with Netflix right now, and they have a brand new release that's a sequel to Believer. Now here in this video, I am recommending The First Believer. Like I said, there's a Netflix original sequel that just came out a couple of months ago. I'll touch on that after talking about the first one. This is an undercover cop movie. You follow one agent in particular trying to bring down this notorious Mr. Lee, this man no one's ever really seen or is unsure of who he is, and you deal with some psychotic criminals in this movie, some just crazed gangsters, and it makes for some really intense scenes that are just thoroughly entertaining to watch, especially if you love the gangster movie genre like I do. And Believer develops this really rich sort of underbelly world in this first movie, and then they elaborate on it with the sequel. Now, the weird thing about Believer is it goes into this kind of wild direction, and then as you get towards the end of the first movie, there's actually a big gap. There's sort of a big leap forward in time. I think I can say that without spoiling anything. The sequel is what happened in that gap of time. So if you watch Believer, you love it, you feel like the ending is a little bit weird or you're missing something, there is a sequel available on Netflix. Now, I felt like the sequel got a little bit too convoluted and I did not like it as much as I loved the original, but still it is pretty cool that Netflix produced a sequel and released it as a Netflix original. Now, my next pick is a Western that actually made it into the top 10 on Netflix the week that it was added a couple of months back. And I'd like to think I had something to do with that when I mentioned it was coming to Netflix, because Seraphim Falls is not a very well-known movie. It's also not a very straightforward Western, or at least it ends up not being a very straightforward Western, even though it starts out like one. This is a manhunt movie starring Pierce Brosnan and Liam Neeson. You're in the American West, shortly after the Civil War. You can almost picture this happening at the same time as The Outlaw Josie Wales. A movie I do like better than this, but a movie that takes place in the same world. And it is an excellent manhunt movie. There are some fantastic scenes of action and survival, some scenes where they cross over, and then, kind of in the third act of this movie, things take a turn and it ends up being a very thought-provoking Western that goes into a direction no other Western has gone. I can see where some people wouldn't like it, but others will definitely love it. It ends up being a pretty interesting art film, or at least that's how I'm going to put it here in this review without spoiling anything. But if you love Westerns, you love the people involved, this makes a really cool watch, especially if you can kind of keep an open mind as you approach, again, that final act. And then because this is a list of the most graphic movies included with Netflix right now, I had to include Joker, which is easily the most popular movie on this list, but man, did it end up being a banger. I never would have expected that the director of The Hangover and Old School could have made a movie like this. Now, I realize it takes from Martin Scorsese's early movies, but it does so perfectly. While there are a lot of influences at play here, the two big ones are Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy. The plot line follows The King of Comedy fairly closely, but appropriately so, it is a much darker approach. It's dark in the same way that Taxi Driver was. Joker has a similar color palette to Taxi Driver. It deals with a lot of the same themes. Joaquin Phoenix's performance even kind of has a Travis Bickle quality to it at times. My point with all that is that even though Joker is extremely derivative, it's deriving from some incredible movies, and it's doing so in a really skillful way and a very appropriate way for this origin story of the Joker. So I thought it was a brilliant concept from the start, and then was pleasantly surprised at how well it actually ended up working out. Okay, my next pick is based on a true story and is one of the most intense stories of survival I've ever seen put to film, if not the second most intense survival story I've ever seen put to film, The Impossible. Now, this very closely follows the story of a real family after the Indian Ocean tsunami hits a resort in Thailand. Now, for this being one of the biggest natural disasters in our lifetime, it was an interesting choice for them to focus on this one family. I'm sure there were so many harrowing stories that they could have pulled from, but what you get with The Impossible is an insanely intense depiction of the tsunami itself. You're talking top-tier filmmaking. A lot of what you're seeing is real, it's real water, it's not CGI, it's actual stunts, miniatures, all sorts of stuff to make the actual tsunami event so insanely realistic. It's really an amazing achievement of filmmaking. And then the movie ultimately ends up being about the aftermath. Not just how they survived this disaster, but how they ended up finding each other and reconnecting. It's a really intense ride, but it's so well done. All of the acting's top notch. You've got Ewan McGregor, Naomi Watts, a very young Tom Holland who brings the heat, and everything feels incredibly raw and authentic, which is why this movie gets such big points from me and such a strong recommendation over the years. It's actually directed by J.A. Bayona, who has another movie featured higher up on this list. But we will change things up a bit with my next pick, which has a tone that's very different from anything else on this list, but I absolutely love Brawl in Cell Block 99. This is from director S. Craig Zahler, who's most famous for Bone Tomahawk and Dragged Across Concrete. My personal favorite movie of his, though, is definitely Brawl in Cell Block 99. Now, you do have to be a patient viewer for this one. It's fairly slow-paced in the first half, but I thought it was all interesting. Again, it's got a unique kind of throwback tone to it that I absolutely love. Vince Vaughn is amazing in this movie. I love his performance. The lines that were written for him are not only entertaining, but also really poignant at times. And then shortly after he's put in prison, this movie completely changes its tone, and I love that tone even more than the first tone you get from it. It's wild, it's far-fetched, it didn't quite exist in our reality. There's some elements to it that are kind of like hyper-real, almost in the way that Tarantino movies are, but again, with its own unique flavor. Vince Vaughn is a real brawler in this movie, and there are some insanely graphic moments that are all done with real practical effects. I love the shit out of this movie. It's one of my favorites currently available on Netflix. It's so cool that it exists, and honestly, it's been a while since Dragged Across Concrete released. I think he's due for a new one. If you like getting movie recommendations like this, definitely consider clicking the subscribe button and the like button. It really is a great way to let the algorithm know you'd like to see more stuff like this in the future. But before my number one pick on this list, I want to give you some honorable mentions. These are things that could have been included on this list, but were kind of at the back of the pack, so I'll make quick work of these. My first honorable mention is Backcountry. This is actually based on a true story. You follow a fairly young couple that are out on a hiking trip where they become lost, which is terrifying enough, but as they try to find their way home, they begin to realize they're being stalked by a large bear. Now, this one is fairly slow-paced. It's also fairly low budget, but once the bear stalking and attack starts to happen, not only is it graphic, but it's also really tense and feels really real for a low-budget movie. I happen to think Reptile was a pretty excellent investigation movie, but it did miss the mark. I felt like it was a little bit too predictable at times. In fact, I was surprised how easily I was able to predict some of the stuff, but I loved Benicio del Toro's performance in this movie. I haven't seen him star in anything in quite a while, and per usual, I thought he did a great job. I thought some of the rest of the cast was really good, and it's kind of a creepily violent movie at times. It's got some really eerie moments in it. This was one I felt like I could have loved if they didn't fumble around with a couple of the storytelling elements. If you came to this list just looking for hyper-violence, I recommend Carter. This also comes from South Korea. It also has a good dubbed version. This one is filmed as if it's one continuous shot, and my goodness, if you're not into it in the first 7 minutes, the movie's probably not for you. But if you love where it's going by the 10-minute mark, strap in because it's over 2 hours of that, and it's almost non-stop. I also really loved David Fincher's The Killer. The only reason it didn't make it onto this list, even though it's a very graphic movie that I highly recommend, I've recommended it several times recently, so it didn't really have a place here, but I know some people were not hot on this. They felt like it was just another assassin movie, and it is, but it's another assassin movie directed by one of the most detail-oriented directors working today, and I'm telling you, if you revisit it, The Killer is laced with details you didn't notice on the first or even second watch. And then we'll wrap up my honorable mentions with one of the most famously graphic movies of all time, Bonnie and Clyde. This is an excellent classic crime movie that I do recommend, and it did have a place on the list, but mainly just for the final shootout sequence. This movie is famously one of the most graphic because it was the first time they were using squibs in a big movie like this, which is what makes it look like someone got shot. And my goodness, people are turned into Swiss cheese in this movie, and no one had seen that in a movie before. Not to that detail, making Bonnie and Clyde one of the most shocking movies to have ever hit screens. Not so much anymore, but it still holds up as an excellent classic bank robber movie that's actually based on real life. But my number one pick is also based on real life. It's also one of the newer movies released on Netflix, and also one of the most award-nominated movies Netflix has ever released, deservedly so, Society of the Snow. Now, this is the true story of the rugby team stranded out in the Andes Mountains. I remember learning all about this in high school, watching the documentary, being just enthralled with how these guys survived out there for so long. In itself, just hearing the story, having someone tell it to you, it's one of the most harrowing stories of survival ever told. I was amazed at the filmmaking of Society of the Snow. The movie makes you feel cold. It is so intense. You feel like you're in the plane with these guys at almost every moment. The camera never misses a moment to capture something insanely dramatic. People freezing to death, deciding to eat their loved ones, trying to climb up out of this mountain with almost no muscle mass left on their bodies, getting hit with avalanche after avalanche, literally being buried in the snow. And again, the filmmaking quality of this movie is not like any other Netflix original. It is top-notch stuff. It makes it feel like it's happening to you almost. This was a difficult watch for me. Now, I will say there's not one moment on camera that is particularly awful or off-putting. They handle all this stuff with a lot of respect. But with all due respect, these guys survived like cockroaches. And that's not me calling them cockroaches or anything awful. It is mind-boggling to me that the human body could have withstood everything that you see them do in this movie. This is easily one of the best Netflix original movies I've ever seen. That doesn't mean it's my favorite. Like, this kind of stuff is not necessarily entertaining to me, but quality-wise, in terms of how good of a film it is, my goodness, I was blown away at how top-notch this movie is. If you haven't watched it yet, definitely check it out. But do it at a time when you're ready for it, because it is an intense watch, and I think you really do need to be mentally invested in it to just wrap your head around how amazing their survival was in this story. But that is the list. Let me know if you have any additional recommendations down in the top pinned comment, and don't forget to go check out that factor link and use my code so you can get that great discount. But I will keep making these videos as long as y'all keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this Netflix episode, and you will see me on the next one.